My name is Daniel Herrera, and what I'm about to share is not just a story, but a testimony of pain, deceit, and liberation. I say this because for a long time, I lived in a relentless search for purpose, something that could fill the emptiness that consumed me inside. Although I tried to find answers in different paths, nothing seemed to be enough. My life revolved around a vicious cycle of discontent, a persistent feeling that something essential was missing, but I didn't know how to name it. Then, Andres, an old childhood friend, reappeared in my life, bringing with him an unexpected solution. I remember exactly the day we met after so long. He was different. His posture was firm. His gaze exuded tranquility and conviction. There was something in him that I didn't recognize, something that seemed to transcend a mere physical change. When I asked what had happened to make him so serene, Andre smiled and said, "I found the truth, Daniel." He spoke with a sparkle in his eyes, with a certainty I had never seen in him. He told me he was part of a new faith, something different from traditional evangelical churches, something that truly transformed lives. He said he had found a divine purpose, that he now understood his place in the world, and that he had been blessed with a unique opportunity to serve something greater than ourselves. At first, I was skeptical. I had always been wary of promises of radical change, and until that point, no religion or philosophy of life had been able to fill the void inside me. But Andres spoke with an almost hypnotic assurance, and that sparked my curiosity. He asked me questions that poked at my wounds. "Do you feel complete, Daniel? Do you feel like your life has a real purpose? Or are you just trying to fill a hole that never disappears?" The truth was that those questions hit me like a sharp blade. He was right. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was fine, there was something inside me that never allowed me to feel fulfillment. Andres insisted that I go meet the community of the Sons of the New Kingdom, a group that, according to him, had found the true light and lived by divine principles. Reluctantly, I accepted his invitation, driven by a mix of curiosity and a desire to find what seemed to be missing in my life. The next day, he took me to meet the community. The place was located far from the city, surrounded by vegetation, almost like a secluded refuge from the world. Upon arrival, I was warmly greeted by the members. They all seemed happy, serene, radiating a peace I hadn't seen in a long time. They smiled sincerely and called me brother, as if I'd already been part of that family. It was there that I met Samuel Montenegro, the leader of the community, a man with an imposing appearance, well-groomed gray hair, and a voice that exuded authority and wisdom. He was not like the traditional pastors I had met before. He didn't shout or make empty promises. His gaze was piercing, and his smile carried a mix of compassion and mystery. "You took your time to arrive, Daniel," were the first words he said to me. That caught me off guard. How could he say I took my time? I had never been there before. Before I could ask, he continued, "The Lord had already shown me you. God has plans for all of us, but only those with an open heart can hear him. You are chosen for something greater, my child." Those words stirred something inside me. How could he know about my inner search, the emptiness that consumed me? Was there really something greater for me here? The following days were an immersion into this new world. With each teaching from Samuel, I became more convinced that I had found something special. The way he spoke about spirituality, about freeing oneself from the binds of the world and connecting with God, made sense to me. I wanted to believe. The community members lived together, shared everything, and seemed like a true family. The sense of unity was something I had never experienced. There was no selfishness, no greed. They treated each other with respect, helped one another, and that gave me the feeling that I had finally found a place where I belonged. Andres was with me every step, encouraging me to follow the teachings and trust what Samuel said. He explained to me that this was not just a simple religious community, but a divine calling. One day, Samuel called me for a private conversation. His tone was gentle but firm. "Daniel, are you ready to leave the world behind and accept your true mission?" "What do you mean?" I asked, a bit confused. "You've always searched for a purpose, but you never found it because you were looking in the wrong places. Here, you can be more than an ordinary man. You can be an instrument of God. But to do that, you must surrender yourself, body, and soul." There was something in that conversation that left me torn. Part of me was eager to believe that I had finally found my path. But another part felt like something was slightly wrong. Nevertheless, with each passing day, I felt myself sinking deeper into that reality. Samuel's words echoed in my mind, and I began to believe that perhaps he was truly an enlightened man, a prophet sent by God. Before long, I was accepted as one of the sons of the new kingdom. For the first time in a long while, I thought I had found something real, something that completed me. What I didn't know was that, behind that welcoming environment and apparent spirituality, there was a dark truth that would soon begin to reveal itself. The moment I stepped into that community as a true member, everything changed. I was no longer just a curious visitor. I was a disciple, chosen to walk the sacred path that Samuel Montenegro had built. There was an initiation ritual, and I accepted to participate without hesitation, convinced that this was the purpose I had been searching for. The ceremony took place on a night lit only by the moon and the candles placed around a small lake within the property. All the members were dressed in white and in complete silence, forming a circle. Samuel, positioned to the center, wore a golden robe and held an ancient book that he said contained divine revelations that only he could interpret. Today, Daniel Herrera dies to the world and is reborn to the kingdom. He proclaimed with his calm yet firm voice. I was led to the edge of the lake and instructed to kneel. Samuel placed his hands on my head and murmured words I didn't fully understand, but that sent chills down my spine. He then poured water over my forehead and said, "From this moment, you will be known as Ephraim, for you are the one chosen to bear fruit and multiply the word of the Lord." I heard voices whispering amen around me and felt a wave of emotion rush through my body. It was an intense moment, and for a brief instant, I truly believed that I had been reborn into a new life. The members embraced me with hugs and smiles. There was no resistance or questioning within me. If this was the path that God had set for me, who was I to refuse? The community lived in perfect harmony. No one went hungry, no one had more than the other, and everything was shared. There was no money inside, as Samuel preached that materialism was a poison of the corrupt society. We would work for the common good, and in return, our needs would be met. Furthermore, everyone referred to Samuel as the chosen one, and his wife, Clara, as Mother Clara. They were not just leaders. They were sacred figures, destined to guide the faithful on the path of light. Questioning Samuel is questioning the will of God, I was told many times, and I accepted this truth without contesting it. My wife, Carolina, arrived a few days later, and her reception was warm. The women of the community surrounded her, smiling, saying she was finally where she was meant to be. Unlike me, Carolina did not undergo baptism immediately. First, she had to go through a purification process where she would learn to abandon her worldly past and become a servant worthy of the kingdom. At first, nothing seemed strange. In fact, I felt that I was finally where I was meant to be. I left behind my vices, abandoned old habits that kept me from a life of faith, and became a new person. I felt clean, renewed. For the first time in years, I believed I was on the right path. But that feeling didn't last long. As the days went by, I began to notice that there was something peculiar about how the rules were followed in there. The control was absolute, but disguised as spiritual care. Every decision, no matter how small, passed through the hands of Samuel and Clara. The prayer times, daily activities, fasts, and sacred readings. Nothing happened without them determining it. Furthermore, Samuel had a peculiar way of teaching us. He didn't just preach, he also tested us. Do you truly trust in the kingdom? He would ask in his sermons. Or do you still carry doubts inside? Whenever someone hesitated, even for a moment, they were invited to undergo a period of reflection. This period could be an entire day of fasting, a night praying on their knees, or a public confession in front of the community. It was a subtle form of control, but no one seemed to see it that way. With each trial, the faithful supposedly came out stronger, more purified. And those who failed were advised to submit more, to surrender without reservations. Suffering purifies, they repeated. I want to believe this, but I started to notice small details that unsettled me. The community members were equal, but Samuel and Clara were above everyone. While we worked in the fields, cooked, and cleaned the accommodations, they didn't touch anything. Samuel said that his spiritual responsibilities required his full time and that the kingdom should sustain him so he could guide the chosen ones. It was our duty to serve him, for that was God's will. The chosen one does not need to worry about worldly needs, they told me once. I accepted this explanation for a while, but then I began to notice even stranger things. Samuel always ate better than everyone else. While we ate simple dishes made with the basic ingredients from the farm, he and Clara had access to foods that never made it to us. But the justification was always the same. The chosen one needed to be strengthened to continue his mission. Another detail that bothered me was the role of women. While the men were allowed to speak at certain meetings and even ask limited questions, women were never allowed to speak without permission. Carolina noticed this before I did and commented, I don't know if I feel comfortable with this, Daniel. It seems like they have fewer rights here. These are Samuel's teachings, my love. We must trust him. I replied, trying to convince myself that it was the right thing. But what if it's not? I fell silent. I didn't want to admit that I was also beginning to question it. Women were taught that their role was to obey and serve, for their mission was to support men on their spiritual journey. Pride is the greatest enemy of women. The Lord demands obedience, they were constantly told. Carolina did not directly oppose this, but I saw in her gaze that she was not convinced. That was when I realized the true danger of that place. There, no one could question anything. From the moment I was baptized and received my sacred name, I no longer belonged to myself. I was Ephraim, a disciple. My life no longer belonged to me. And if I wanted to turn back, what if Carolina decided she no longer wanted to be there? At that moment, I realized that this was not an option. We were trapped, but we didn't know it yet. The routine in the community was unchanging and inflexible. Each day began at sunrise with the ringing of a bell that echoed through the accommodations, a deep sound that awakened us for another day of service to the kingdom. The first commitment was always the same. Samuel's morning sermon, a mandatory moment for all members. No one could miss it. We gathered in the large hall, a spacious but simple area, with no decoration except for a large white banner with a golden symbol in the center, which Samuel said represented the divine light. We sat on the floor, in a reverent position, while he ascended to the improvised pulpit, his stern gaze sweeping over each one of us before he spoke. The world out there is lost. Only here is salvation, he proclaimed, and a chorus of Amen responded in unison. The sermons were long, often lasting for hours, and always revolved around the same message: absolute obedience, detachment, and sacrifice. Attachment to the flesh is the prison of the soul. Money, ambition, and vanity are chains that prevent enlightenment, he repeated every morning. After his sermon, we were assigned to our tasks. Some went to the fields, others to the kitchen, and some took care of the property's maintenance. There were tasks for everyone, and no one could avoid them. Samuel never worked. Neither did Clara. They were the spiritual leaders, and it was our duty to serve them. In the evening, when the workday ended, we would gather again for the purification rituals. We called it collective prayers, but in practice, they were public confession sessions. Every member was encouraged, or rather forced, to stand up and reveal their sins before the others. The Lord sees everything, but demands that the truth be exposed, Samuel would say. We had to confess impure thoughts, doubts, and failures committed throughout the day. If someone couldn't remember anything, Samuel would insist until the person admitted something. After all, no one was pure enough to pass a day without sinning. There's always something hidden in the heart of man, he would say, staring at us. If you don't confess, it means you are hiding the truth from God. After the confessions, Samuel or Clara would decide what penance would be applied. Sometimes a simple one-day fast was enough. Other times, the person was instructed to sleep on the floor as a sign of humility. And in more serious cases, a period of isolation was imposed so the individual could reflect on their lack of faith. At first, I thought it was a necessary sacrifice to grow spiritually. After all, wasn't that what all religions preached? The purification of the soul through renunciation? But little by little, I began to realize that we weren't faithful. We were prisoners. Gradually, it became clear that Samuel had control over everything. Every aspect of our lives was monitored. We couldn't leave without permission. Samuel said the outside world was a corrupt place and that any contact with it could contaminate us. When someone needed to go into town to buy supplies, they could only do so with the express permission of the leaders and always accompanied by a more experienced member. The enemy lurks out there, waiting for one of you to falter so it can attack us, Samuel warned us. He instilled fear in such a way that many didn't even consider leaving. We believed that if we left the community, we would be handed over to evil. Moreover, our money no longer belonged to us. Samuel decreed that all members' belongings should be given to the kingdom because money belongs to God and we are merely its stewards. At first, this idea seemed like a noble concept. If we were living as a community of faith, it made sense for everyone to contribute. But then, I realized that no one besides Samuel and Clara had access to what was collected. Every salary, inheritance, or material possession anyone brought was immediately transferred to a fund managed by them. Greed is poison. Those who do not give everything with an open heart are not yet ready for the kingdom, and no one dared to question it. Little by little, something began to change inside me. I started noticing small inconsistencies. Why did Samuel need new, high-quality clothes while we always wore the same worn garments? Why did Clara have a private room with a comfortable bed while the members slept in simple accommodations? Why were only they allowed access to the phone and the car stored in a shed? The more I thought, the more doubts grew inside me. But I couldn't say anything. Questioning was a sin. Questioning was doubting the word of God. And those who dared show any hesitation faced spiritual corrections. They weren't physical punishments, at least not directly. But public humiliation, isolation, and food deprivation were common punishments for those who showed signs of weakness. I saw a man named Luis being forced to kneel for hours because he expressed doubt about one of Samuel's teachings. I saw a woman, Patricia, go 3 days without eating because she admitted to missing the family she had left behind. Little by little, I began to realize that this was not just a religious community. It was a mental prison. What scared me the most was that, despite everything, no one tried to escape. Fear was stronger than any desire for freedom. Samuel had built such a well-structured web that we all believed the problem was with us, not him. If we felt doubt, it was because we were still impure. If we felt like leaving, it was because the enemy was tempting us. If something seemed wrong, it was our lack of faith that prevented us from seeing the truth. And so, day after day, the community functioned like a clock, with no one daring to challenge the system. But deep down, something inside me screamed that this was wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I needed to find a way out. The problem was, could I? The rules in the community of the Sons of the New Kingdom seemed to have a life of their own. At first, they followed a standard of discipline, but over time, they became even stricter. Small slip-ups, which before went unnoticed, were now treated as serious failures requiring spiritual corrections. It was as if the community had turned into a minefield. Any wrong step could have consequences, and these consequences were brutal. When someone showed doubt or resistance, the entire group would gather for a sort of collective punishment ritual. They called it the purification of the spirit, but in practice, it was just public humiliation. The punished person would be placed at the center of the main hall, in front of everyone, while Samuel or Clara confronted them about their lack of faith. The accusations were made calmly, with an apparently compassionate tone, but filled with manipulation. "Brother, we've noticed your soul is restless. What are you trying to hide from God?" Samuel would say, his firm voice echoing through the hall. If the person denied having committed any wrong, the response was always the same. If you can't see your own sins, it's because the enemy has already blinded your heart. The punishments varied according to the severity of the transgression. Some are forced to fast for days, with no food or water, until they admitted they were wrong. Others had to sleep outside the accommodations, exposed to the cold and darkness. And there were those who were forced to kneel before the community and confess, through tears, sins they often hadn't committed, just to end the torment. Over time, fear became the foundation of everything. No one dared show doubt, because we knew that Samuel saw us like a hawk watching its prey, and I didn't want to be the next target. Carolina had always been strong. From the moment she arrived in the community, she followed the rules, even though she wasn't completely convinced of some of them. But what started as small unease soon turned into something bigger. The first shock came when she realized how women were treated differently. At first, it seemed like just a cultural matter within the community. But over the weeks, it became clear that women had no voice. They couldn't speak without permission. They couldn't make decisions without consulting Samuel or Clara. They couldn't even look a man in the eye for too long, as that could be interpreted as vanity. Carolina realized that while men had various tasks and participated in some meetings, women were limited to domestic work and blind obedience. It was then that she told me something that made my stomach churn. "Daniel, this isn't right." "I know it isn't." I looked at her, feeling the same discomfort, but the only thing I could respond with was, "We need to be patient. This is part of their faith." But the truth was, I too already felt that there was something deeply wrong with that place. The moment that made me wake up happened a few days later. Carolina was talking to one of the women in the community, an older lady named Teresa, who had been there for years. "Why can't we speak at the meetings?" Carolina asked, trying to sound casual. "God gave us a voice, didn't he?" Teresa stopped immediately. Her eyes widened, and she quickly looked around, as if she was sure no one else was listening. Then, in a low, firm voice, she replied, "Be careful, sister. Those who question end up being purified." Carolina turned pale. She didn't need to ask what that meant. We knew exactly what happened to those who questioned Samuel and his leadership. It was at that moment that I realized the truth. We weren't in a religious community. We were in a prison. A prison where the punishment wasn't chains of iron, but fear and manipulation. After this warning, Carolina and I stopped talking about our doubts out loud. We began to watch each other more carefully, paying attention to every little detail around us. And that's when we discovered something even more terrifying. There was always someone watching us. If we were in a group, there was always a fixed gaze on us. If we went for a walk, someone would discreetly follow us. If a conversation lasted longer than it should, a leader would soon appear to bless the conversation and bring the focus back to the doctrine. They called it spiritual protection, but we knew what it really meant. We no longer had privacy. From that moment on, every word that came out of our mouths could be used against us. And the worst part? I no longer knew who to trust. If we were ever accused of doubt, the community itself would condemn us. Our own brothers and sisters would publicly humiliate us, fast for us, expel us from the accommodations, and force us to confess sins we didn't commit. They believed they were doing it out of love, but it was just fear. Fear had become the constant shadow in our lives. And that's when I understood that there was no easy escape. If we wanted to leave, we would need more than just courage. We would need to survive. The atmosphere in the community of the sons of the new kingdom was becoming increasingly oppressive. Fear controlled everyone, and questioning any decision made by Samuel or Clara was unthinkable. I had already noticed that something was wrong, but I still tried to convince myself that it was part of the spiritual discipline necessary to achieve enlightenment. However, everything changed the day Matteo decided to challenge the prophet. Matteo was one of the oldest members of the cult. He had been there for years and had always been faithful to Samuel's teachings. But in recent months, he had begun to show signs of dissatisfaction. Sometimes, during collective prayers, I would see his tense expression as if something was disturbing him. I should have realized he was about to break. The scene happened during one of the morning meetings when all the members were gathered to listen to Samuel. Samuel was speaking about sacrifice, about how we should abandon attachment to the material world. He repeated his favorite words: "The body is just an instrument. Our true wealth lies in the soul." At that moment, Matteo stood up. His face was tight, his fists clenched. Everyone looked at him in shock. "If the body is just an instrument, why do you never work like we do?" The silence in the hall was instant. The air grew heavy. No one had ever spoken to Samuel like that. Matteo continued, his voice full of frustration. "We go hungry. We sleep on the floor. We work from dawn till dusk. But you always have quality food. You always wear new clothes. You always live in comfort. How is that detachment? How is that sacrifice?" There was a nervous murmur among the faithful. Some people lowered their heads, as if the very question was a sin. Others looked at Samuel, waiting for his reaction. And the reaction came. Cold, cruel, immediate. Samuel smiled, a calculated smile, with no trace of surprise. He stood up calmly and walked toward Matteo. They stood face to face. Then, Samuel spoke, his voice unhurried, with no trace of apparent anger. "Brother Matteo, I see that pride has consumed your heart. Your soul is contaminated by doubt, and doubt is the gateway to sin." He made a subtle gesture, and two men approached. I didn't know their names, only that they were the protectors of the kingdom. They grabbed Matteo by the arms. "What are you doing?" Matteo tried to break free, but they were too strong. "You will be purified, brother," Samuel declared, still with his calm smile. Matteo was dragged to the center of the hall. His wrists were tied. He tried to resist, but it was useless. The protectors forced him to kneel before Samuel. "Ask for forgiveness, brother Matteo," Samuel ordered. "This is madness," Matteo shouted, his voice choking. "Don't you see what's happening?" He's manipulating all of us." Samuel sighed and shook his head like a disappointed father. Pride is the greatest poison of the soul. The two men tightened the ropes around Mateo's wrists. He groaned in pain, asked for forgiveness. "Never." Samuel sighed again. He looked at Clara, who had been silent up until that point. She approached, placed her hand on Mateo's head, and murmured something. "You'll be healed, brother. But for that, you must accept your purification." Mateo gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with fury and despair. But then, he realized there was no way out. There were dozens of faithful around him, watching the scene, but no one moved to help. Everyone was frozen, too terrified to intervene. I was too. After a few seconds of silence, Mateo's resistance broke. He lowered his head. "Forgive me," he whispered. "What did you say, brother?" Samuel leaned in, pretending not to hear. "Forgive me." His voice was now a whisper. Samuel smiled, satisfied. "God accepts you back, my son." Mateo was released, but his gaze was never the same. He had been broken. After that day, something changed inside me. I couldn't forget Mateo's look while he was being humiliated. I couldn't forget the silence of the other members, the fear etched on every face. And then I began to pay attention to something that had seemed insignificant before. The whispers. The women in the community would talk among themselves, always in hushed voices, always looking over their shoulders. And in their eyes, there was a different kind of terror. That's how I first heard about the private meetings. The prophet calls some of the sisters for a special purification process. I heard one woman murmur to another, "Have you been called?" "Not yet, but I heard Maria was. She's never been the same again." My body shivered. What did this purification mean? Why did no one speak about what happened in these meetings? I started to observe. It was always the same pattern. Samuel would choose a woman, usually the youngest or the newest in the community. She was called to a private meeting, and the next day, her behavior would change. They became quieter, more submissive, more empty. Some of their eyes were always red, but when asked, they said they were just tired. But I knew it was fear. With each passing day, my heart grew heavier. Mateo had been punished for questioning. The women were being called for something unknown and dark. Fear ruled everything around us. I tried to deny it, tried to convince myself that this was part of a spiritual process. But deep down, I knew the truth. Samuel was not a holy man. He was a tyrant, a manipulator who controlled everyone with an iron fist, disguised as a pastor. And worse still, I was part of it. I was inside. I had surrendered. And now, I knew that leaving would not be so simple. That night was the beginning of my end within the community of the sons of the new kingdom. I had already been feeling the weight of the manipulation, the absolute control Samuel had over all of us. But until then, I had resisted fully seeing the truth. I still tried to convince myself that it all had a purpose, that the sacrifices and punishments were necessary for our spiritual evolution. But when Samuel announced that Carolina would have to undergo a purification ritual, all my certainties collapsed. My blood ran cold. It was as if my entire body had been plunged into ice. His words echoed in my mind, repeating themselves like an inescapable sentence. Carolina, my wife, the woman I loved, was now marked for something I knew, deep down in my soul, had nothing spiritual about it. I tried to argue. My instinct was to shout, protest, demand that it be stopped. But before I could take a step toward Carolina, I felt hands holding my arms, pulling me back with a force I couldn't fight. They were the brothers of the faith, those who, like me, had completely surrendered to the cult. They were not there to hurt me, but to protect me from myself, to prevent me from committing an act of rebellion against Samuel. Father Samuel knows what's best. That was the only thing they said, their voices firm and unquestionable. as they immobilized me. I fought. My whole body went into shock, trying to escape their grip, but it was useless. The weight of the group was stronger than my strength. All I could do was watch, helpless, as Carolina was taken to one of Samuel's private rooms, surrounded by 2 women escorting her as if it were a privilege, not a condemnation. Her eyes met mine one last time before the door closed. There was fear in them, desperation, but above all, resignation. That look destroyed me. I knew what was going to happen. I knew what purification meant. Samuel had always preached that women needed to free themselves from the impure influence of the outside world, that they had to be renewed and completely surrendered to the kingdom. But what he never openly said, what only the whispers among the women revealed, was that this renewal required total submission. Samuel took them for himself. He broke them. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, unable to breathe properly, unable to understand how this was happening right in front of me. The world around me seemed to lose sound. The faithful beside me spoke, held me, but their voices were only distant noises. All that existed in my mind was Carolina on the other side of that door, alone, defenseless, being destroyed. The minutes turned into hours. Every second was torment. I wanted to run, break down that door, tear her away from there, but my body no longer responded. Terror completely overtook me. I don't know how long passed before the door finally opened. Carolina emerged. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. Her steps were slow, mechanical, as if her soul had been ripped out of her. I freed myself from the hands that were still holding me and ran to her, but when I touched her, she didn't react. Her body was there, but Carolina was no longer Carolina. There was something broken inside her, something I knew I could never fix. I tried to speak, tried to hold her, tried to find her eyes, but all I saw was a deep emptiness, an abyss of pain I had never witnessed before. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't say anything. She just slowly moved away, walking toward the women's dormitory without looking back. I stood still, breathless, my stomach churning, feeling a despair I couldn't put into words. That's when I understood, with brutal clarity, that there were no more justifications, no more excuses, no more attempts to understand what was happening there as a spiritual sacrifice. Samuel was a monster. He had just destroyed my wife in front of me, and everyone around us continued as if nothing had happened. The cult was not a religious community. It was a hell disguised as a paradise. And I knew that from that moment on, my only option was to escape. But for that, I needed to make sure that Carolina could survive. And at that moment, I didn't know if there was anything left of her to save. Time inside the community seemed to stop, but for Carolina and me, every second was an unbearable burden. After that night, after what Samuel did, there was no pretending that this was a sacred place anymore. The weight of the truth was crushing. I couldn't deceive myself any longer, couldn't hold on to any excuse for what was happening. The only thing left was fear and the certainty that we had to get out of there, no matter the cost. But escaping was nearly impossible. Those who tried to flee were hunted down, dragged back, and subjected to punishments ranging from total isolation to physical torture disguised as extreme purification. No one ever managed to leave, or at least that's what they wanted us to believe. The truth was, no one knew what happened to those who disappeared. Some were never seen again, others returned completely changed with no trace of resistance. I knew Carolina couldn't take it anymore. She no longer spoke. She spent her days in silence, not looking directly at anyone, not reacting to anything. She simply obeyed every order mechanically, as if her soul had been ripped out and replaced by an empty shell. I knew that if we stayed any longer, she would be lost completely. And if Carolina was lost, I would be lost too. We pretended submission. It was the only way to survive while we planned an escape. I spent the days playing my role perfectly, participating in the rituals, working in the fields, repeating Samuel's words like a faithful disciple. I did what I needed to do, so no one would suspect that. Inside, my mind was on fire, constantly formulating plans and possibilities. That's when I heard a name that changed everything. One of the older members mentioned, almost unintentionally, a man named Raphael, a former member who had managed to escape years before. He spoke with contempt, saying that Raphael was a traitor, that he had rejected the kingdom and surrendered to the impure world. But as others cursed him, my mind began to work quickly. If Raphael escaped, he knew how to leave. If he was alive, I needed to find him. The search for him was a dangerous game. I couldn't ask directly. I had to be careful, discreet. Every conversation was a risk. But over time, I gathered small bits of information that led me to what I needed to know. Raphael lived in a small town a few hours away, hidden from the cult, trying to rebuild his life away from the terror of the past. Making contact with him was even harder. We didn't have cell phones. We couldn't just go out and look for him. So, I did the unthinkable. I asked for permission to go to the town to gather supplies for the community. Samuel rarely allowed anyone to leave, but after years of loyalty, I had earned a certain level of trust. He allowed me to go, accompanied by one of the sect's guardians, a man named Elias, who was one of Samuel's most devoted followers. When we arrived in the city, every second was a nerve-wracking test. I needed to find Raphael. I needed to do it without Elias noticing. Time was short. My heart pounded in my chest like an out-of-sync drum, but when I finally managed to slip away for a few minutes and reach the address I had managed to discover, he was there. Raphael was in shock when he saw me. At first, he thought I was someone sent by Samuel to bring him back. But when I explained our situation, he understood. He knew exactly what I was going through because he had gone through the same thing. He would help us. I returned to the community as if nothing had happened. I spoke little on the way back, trying to hide my anxiety. Elias didn't suspect anything, or at least didn't show any suspicion. But something inside me told me we needed to act quickly. The plan was made in the following days. Raphael couldn't come to get us, because if the sect's guardian saw him, they would immediately know he was helping with the escape. But he taught us the paths we could take to escape without being seen, showed us the weaknesses in the community surveillance. He knew every detail. He had done this before. The waiting was unbearable. Every night felt like an unbearably heavy burden. Carolina remained immersed in silence. But when I looked at her the night before our escape, I saw that there was still something inside her that wanted to fight. We needed to make this work. On the appointed night, we left in complete silence, just with the clothes on our bodies, carrying nothing that could delay us. Every step was a risk. Every sound around us made us hold our breath. The path to the exit was a maze of tension. We had to cross the farmland, past the accommodations without being seen, and reach the farthest fence on the property. The main gate was impossible, always watched. But Raphael had pointed out a spot in the fence where there was a gap, a weakened part we could cross. When we got close, we saw that one of the sex guards was too close. My heart raced. Carolina squeezed my hand tightly, the first time she had touched me since that terrible night. We waited. We waited so long that it felt like an eternity. The guard finally moved away, and we moved. We passed through the fence, tearing our clothes on the rusty wires, with fear burning inside us. At any moment, we could be discovered. If we knew what would happen. We would be hunted. But we kept going, running through the field, not looking back, not stopping, not thinking about what was left behind. There was only one thing on our minds: survival. We ran to the place Raphael had pointed out, where a car was waiting for us. When we got in and the doors closed, it felt like we could finally breathe. But the relief lasted only a second. Because as we pulled away from the community, I looked through the back window and realized that the escape wouldn't be the end. Samuel wouldn't just let us disappear. And what we discovered later, when we understood what really happened behind that cult, was even worse than we had imagined. The escape was just the beginning. The relief of leaving the community behind lasted little, because we knew Samuel Montenegro wouldn't leave us in peace. He would never allow us to escape unscathed, let alone speak about what really happened inside the sons of the new kingdom. His influence was greater than we had imagined, and for years, he had maintained an invisible empire based on fear, manipulation, and the psychological destruction of those who fell into his hands. When we arrived in the city, the first thing we did was seek out the authorities. There was no time for hesitation anymore. It didn't matter the fear, it didn't matter what might happen afterward. We needed to tell the truth. The police station seemed cold, impersonal, and for the first time, we felt like part of the real world again. Sitting in front of a police officer, seeing a notepad, and hearing questions asked with skepticism was a brutal shock after so many years trapped in a completely distorted reality. Everything there seemed both safe and distant, as if we were still trapped in Samuel's shadow. Carolina hardly spoke. Her body was there, but her mind seemed to wander between the walls of the police station, as if she was still trying to free herself from the invisible shackles of the sect. I did my best to give voice to what we had lived. Every word was difficult. Reliving what had happened inside was like reliving every day of silent torture, every fearful glance, every subtle manipulation that made us believe we were in the wrong, that we deserved it. I explained how it all started, how I was drawn in by the promise of purpose, how Carolina and I blindly surrendered to Samuel's doctrine. I spoke about the punishments, the forced fasts, the public humiliations, the isolation of those who doubted, and, most of all, the abuses carried out under the pretext of purification. The expressions of the police officers changed when I mentioned this. They had seen it all, but hearing about women being chosen for Samuel's secret rituals made even the most experienced officer shudder. It took hours before we could get everything out. At one point, Carolina squeezed my hand tightly. She found the strength to speak. Her voice was weak, wavering, but the words carried the pain of someone who had lost everything inside that cult. The report was officially filed, but we knew it wouldn't be enough. The police needed evidence, and that's when the voices began to surface. The first woman to come forward was a young woman named Maria Fernanda. She had escaped the cult years earlier, but had never had the courage to report it. She carried the fear that Samuel might find her, that even far away, he still had power over her mind. When she heard that someone else had reported it, that Carolina and I had survived, she decided that she could no longer remain silent. After her, other victims started to appear. Women who had gone through the purification rituals. Men who had been subjected to extreme punishments for daring to question Samuel. Parents who had lost their children to the cult's absolute control. The police began to connect the dots, investigating old reports that had previously been considered too vague to be taken seriously. The pattern was always the same: broken people, manipulated and trapped within a system where any attempt at resistance was crushed. The reports grew so much that soon the whole country began to take notice. Samuel Montenegro's name appeared in the newspapers. The Sons of a New Kingdom cult was exposed as a criminal organization. What had once been treated as a spiritual community was now being investigated for human trafficking, psychological abuse, and systematic rape. The authorities wasted no time acting. The police operation to invade the community was swift and relentless. Samuel Montenegro was found inside his private room, surrounded by followers who still blindly believed in him. When the police entered, he showed no fear, didn't try to escape. He smiled. The news of his arrest spread like wildfire. Clara was arrested along with him. The kingdom's guardians, those who watched and punished the cult members, were also taken in handcuffs. All those who had upheld that empire of terror fell with the prophet. The media coverage was intense. Reporters crowded outside the police station, trying to capture every detail of the investigation. Interviewing former members, the families of the victims, psychologists who explained the horrors of mental manipulation. The newspapers ran headlines like, "The true face of the sons of the new kingdom. Cruel cult promoted abuse in the name of purification." The ex-members break silence and expose Samuel Montenegro's crimes. Society was in shock. No one imagined that behind the facade of a peaceful community, there was a nightmare that was destroying lives. The trial was long. Carolina and I testified against Samuel, as did other victims. Each testimony was a piece of the truth being reconstructed, a fragment of the darkness that had consumed so many lives. Samuel Montenegro refused to admit any guilt. Before the judges, he maintained his serene posture, saying that it was all a conspiracy against him, that the chosen ones were always persecuted. He said that those accusing him were just ungrateful, weak people who hadn't been strong enough to reach true enlightenment. But the evidence was overwhelming. The victims' testimonies were too much to ignore. The police found diaries, recordings, documents detailing the absolute control he had over his followers. They discovered the finances of the cult, the secret accounts that hid the resources accumulated from the donations of the faithful. Samuel Montenegro was convicted, not just for psychological abuse and manipulation, but also for sexual crimes, forced labor, and spiritual corruption. His sentence was harsh, a punishment that would ensure he would never lead a cult again. When the sentence was read, Carolina cried. But it wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a cry of liberation. Years of terror were finally coming to an end. The cult that had destroyed so many lives was collapsing. But the pain didn't disappear completely. What we lived through inside, there was not erased with Samuel's arrest. The scars remained. The trauma doesn't vanish with a conviction. The difference is that now, we were no longer alone. We survived, and for the first time in a long time, we were free. The fall of Samuel Montenegro and the destruction of the sons of the new kingdom cult didn't erase the past. The arrest of the man who had enslaved us, manipulated us, and broken us from within brought justice, but it didn't bring immediate relief. The scars remained. Some were visible. Others were so deeply rooted inside us that they became part of who we were. Rebuilding our lives from scratch was harder than anyone could imagine. When we left the community and Samuel was convicted, there was nothing left that we belonged to. We had spent years believing that place was our home, that those people were our family. And even though we knew it was all an illusion, a prison disguised as faith, it was hard to completely erase the remnants of what we had lived. The outside world seemed vast and frightening. We were free, but we didn't know how to live as free people anymore. Something inside us still waited for orders, still expected punishment for every mistake, still felt that any act of independence could result in severe reprisal. It was as if the prison was still there, inside our minds, preventing us from breathing fully. Carolina carried an even heavier weight. After what happened to her, after the last night in the community, her soul seemed fragmented. There were moments when she just sat, staring into space, as if lost between the present and the past. Her pain was silent but devastating. She slept little, and when she did, nightmares consumed her. I saw her thrashing in bed, murmuring disconnected words, reliving everything she tried to forget. I also didn't sleep. How could I? All we wanted was to erase the memories, but they were everywhere. The sound of the wind in the trees reminded me of the cold nights in the dormitory. The touch of water during a shower brought back the memory of the forced baptism, the moment when I became Ephraim and stopped being Daniel Herrera. The silence made me remember the fasts, the mandatory confessions, the punishments. Everything seemed heavy with the weight of what we had lived. And then there was the fear, an irrational fear, but impossible to control. Samuel was in prison, but what if he wasn't? What if he found a way out? What if one of his followers still believed in him and wanted revenge? For months, every shadow seemed like a threat. Every unfamiliar person seemed like a spy from the cult. It took a long time before we could walk down the street without looking back, before we could enter a supermarket without feeling suffocated by the presence of other people. But little by little, we found a way. That's when other victims started coming to us. Women who had escaped before us, but never had the courage to report it. Men who still felt guilty for doubting the cult and carried the weight of manipulation on their shoulders. People who had lost everything, family, identity, self-esteem, and didn't know where to start over. They saw us as survivors, as those who had spoken when no one else had the courage. At first, we didn't know how to help. We ourselves were still broken, still struggling to understand what we had lived through. But then we realized that maybe helping others was the only way to heal ourselves. We started small. We created a support group for ex-members of the cult. The first meeting was strange. People arrived hesitantly, sitting in chairs far apart, avoiding eye contact. The silence was oppressive. No one knew how to start, until one of the women began to cry. She didn't say anything. She just cried, and at that moment, we understood everything. We didn't need to speak. We just needed to be there. Little by little, the meetings grew. People from other cults started to show up, people who had gone through similar experiences. Each one carried a different trauma, but they all had one thing in common. They had been destroyed by blind faith in a false prophet. Some were still trying to understand how they had been deceived. Others were angry with themselves, as if they were guilty for believing. Some just wanted to forget, but no one could forget. Many would never fully recover. Some wounds were too deep to heal, but we wanted to do our part. We wanted, at least, to prevent others from falling into the same trap. We started giving lectures on cults and psychological manipulation. We participated in investigations into other religious cults that operated under the same scheme as the Sons of the New Kingdom. We were invited for interviews, documentaries. Every time we spoke about what had happened, we relived everything again. But we knew it was necessary. Silence was the weapon Samuel used for years to keep his cult alive. We wouldn't allow that to continue. There were days when Carolina couldn't get out of bed. Days when everything seemed too heavy to carry on. And I had my moments of despair too. But we learned to support each other. We were no longer the same as before. We would never be again. But together, we learned that freedom is not something you gain all at once. It's a process, one step at a time. The trauma would haunt us forever. There would always be scars. But for the first time, we knew we weren't alone. And that made all the difference. Today, I tell this story not for myself, but for all those who are still trapped in traps like the one that almost destroyed my life. I tell it because I know there are many who, right now, are living under the rule of false prophets, being manipulated, exploited, imprisoned in a faith corrupted by the desire for power. What happened to me could be happening to many others. The Sons of a New Kingdom cult was dismantled. Samuel Montenegro is in prison, his leadership crushed by the truth that we try to hide from ourselves for so long. But despite all this, the fight is not over. His imprisonment did not erase the marks he left, nor did it prevent others like him from emerging. Fanaticism does not die with a single leader. It spreads, reinvents itself, finds new faces, new ways to infiltrate the lives of vulnerable people. At first, after the escape, after the trial, after the sentence, I wanted to believe that everything was resolved. I wanted to believe that by seeing Samuel being handcuffed and dragged out of the courtroom, the nightmare was over. But the truth was that the nightmare was still inside me. I spent nights without sleeping, reliving every detail of what happened. Samuel's words still echoed in my mind, as if they were invisible chains trying to pull me back. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight. It drags on, infiltrates unexpected moments. A smell, a sound, an unfamiliar place. Anything could be a trigger, bringing back a fragment of the hell I lived through. Carolina also struggled with this. Her pain was silent, but constant. Some wounds are invisible, but they leave deeper marks than any physical injury. I saw in her eyes that she still carried pieces of the prison we were in. I knew there were days when she wanted to forget everything, erase every memory, every detail of what we went through. But we knew that wasn't possible. The only way to move forward was to turn the trauma into something greater, to transform our pain into a warning. That's why we began to speak. At first, it was just among the victims in the support group meetings. But soon came the interviews, the investigations into other cults, the reports trying to uncover the pattern behind religious manipulation. And the more we spoke, the more we realized the size of the problem. The Sons of a New Kingdom cult was not unique. There were many others. There were many other false prophets. The manipulation followed an almost identical script. First, they offered a purpose to those who felt lost. Then, little by little, they took everything: freedom, identity, money, even the right to question. They weren't just religious cults. They were networks of psychological and emotional exploitation. We saw the same pattern repeat in extremist churches, in closed communities, in groups that disguised themselves as spiritual organizations but were, in reality, invisible prisons. The victims never realized until it was too late. Many people look from the outside and wonder how someone could be deceived in this way. The answer is simple. No one joins a cult knowing they're joining a cult. What traps us is not faith. It's the desire to belong. It's the emptiness we carry, which makes us believe in promises. It's the need to find meaning in life. We all, at some point, search for something greater, something that fills us. And the false prophets know this. They know exactly how to find the right people. They take advantage of pain, loneliness, desperation. They offer easy answers to hard questions. And by the time we realize it, we're already trapped. That was my greatest lesson. True faith does not imprison. It liberates. Today, my faith remains, but it is different from what it once was. I no longer believe in untouchable leaders, in self-proclaimed prophets, in promises that require blindness and absolute obedience. I have learned that faith and freedom must go hand in hand. If someone asks you to give up everything, your will, your identity, your autonomy, in the name of God, that person does not speak on God's behalf. My mission now is to prevent others from going through what I went through. I don't know how many people I've saved. Maybe none. Maybe I've only made a few think twice before surrendering to something that seems too perfect. But if by telling this story, I can prevent at least one person from falling into the same trap I fell into, it will have been worth it. Justice has been served, but the fight against fanaticism and manipulation is not over. And as long as there are false prophets spreading their nets to capture the most vulnerable, I won't stay silent.